In World of Warcraft, one of the most important decisions before you enter the world of Azeroth can be the class and race you choose to play on your way to 60. Every race in the game is different, not just by looks, but also the special racial abilities they are granted for their journey to max level. Here's a ranking of the races in World of Warcraft from worst to best for WoW Classic Hardcore. The primary criteria for this video is going to be the racial abilities at each race's disposal and how helpful they are for the hardcore leveling experience. This will also include the priest racials available for races that can play priest, but they will be weighed less than the general racials for all classes. Additionally, if the ranking between two choices is close, the starting zone will be taken into account. With that being said, let's get on to the number 8 slot. First up, at number 8, we have Night Elves, which, as far as hardcore goes, are kind of like hard mode compared to the other races in the game. First off, their racial abilities are mostly irrelevant for hardcore across the board. First, they have plus 50% movement speed while dead, which is literally useless. Then, they have 1% extra dodge chance, which is alright, but so minor that it can be mostly disregarded. They also have plus 10 nature resist, which is extremely niche and situational, and is mostly unnoticeable, even when it is useful. The only real decent ability they have is Shadow Meld, which allows them to go stealth as long as they stand still, but it is pretty underwhelming since you can't use it in combat, so it is very situational for things like dodging patrolling mobs while eating or something similar. When it comes to priest racials for Night Elves, they are also pretty underwhelming compared to other races. Star Shards can be used for damage, but it doesn't do a substantial amount and is rather lackluster. Elune's Grace is a decent defensive cooldown actually, and can save you on occasion, but it can be rather unreliable since the dodge chance increase is rather small and many enemies in the game aren't ranged. Lastly, a huge nail in the coffin is that Teldrassil, the Night Elf starting zone, is significantly harder than most others in the game, and this is made worse by the fact that Night Elves will have to do the Wetlands run if they can't get a summon, which can be very sketchy for inexperienced players. Now, at number 7, I'm going to put Humans, the most popular of the classic races. Humans have quite a few racials, but most of them are not very impactful on the hardcore experience. The extra 10% ret bonus from Diplomacy is good for endgame stuff, but for hardcore leveling, it's very negligible. Mace and Sword Spec are similarly useful endgame talents due to the hit rating they provide, and this does transfer somewhat to leveling, but it's not as necessary and it is far less impactful. The extra 5% spirit they get is quite decent for reducing downtime while questing, which is generally good, even though it doesn't suit hardcore explicitly. The perception ability they have grants increased stealth detection for 20 seconds on a 3-minute cooldown, but this is extremely situational since there are not a ton of stealth mobs in the grand scheme of things, and additionally, the cooldown is far too long for it to be reliably used, if you do even remember to use it while questing. For the priest racials, humans do get access to Desperate Prayer, which acts as a sort of mini lay on hands, which can be life-saving in many scenarios, so that does give human a bit of an edge over Night Elves. Lastly, the other priest racial feedback is kind of underwhelming and very conditionally useful, so that it doesn't help human out so much when it comes to hardcore. Next at 6, we have Orc, the most iconic of the Horde races. Orcs don't have many racials compared to other races when you take into account how some are useless for some classes, and what they do have is either quite situational or has minimal impact. Axe specialization, similar to sword and mace specialization, is not as useful while leveling as it is for endgame, but is still a decent bonus. I would note that it is actually nice to have for warriors when they get their Whirlwind Axe if they decide to get it at level 30. Their Blood Fury ability is very hit or miss, since it has the benefit of increased melee damage but the drawback of reduced healing. This ability can be good if you're trying to burst enemies down, but otherwise can hinder you when near death when you would rather heal. So for hardcore, it's not always optimal, but it can make a good last-ditch effort to help you fight for survival. Additionally, it is useless for non-melee classes, which can feel bad compared to other races' damage cooldowns. Hardiness is a pretty strong ability, more so for PvP than PvE, since stuns are less prevalent while questing compared to the other types of CC, but it can still be life-saving in some scenarios, and is pretty nice to have. Lastly, Orcs have Command, which increases the damage of Hunter and Warlock pets by 5%. While this ability is limited in scope, it is very strong, especially for Hunters, where the pet is a large portion of their damage output while questing. The fact that it is so limited though, even if it is strong, does drag Orcs down a bit. Continuing to number 5, we have Dwarf with 4 racials and 2 priest racials. While Dwarf has a few very strong abilities, it also has quite a few that are rather underwhelming. First is Find Treasure. which is not really helpful for hardcore at all, even if it can find you a few chests throughout your journey. Then there is gun skill, which is probably the worst of all the weapon skill racials, since good guns are less common while leveling compared to good bows when it comes to hunter weapons. Dwarves do have frost resistance though, which I would say is the best of the resistance racials, since frost bolts and frost novas are generally more common and more threatening than many other spell schools used by enemies throughout the game. Resisting a frostbolt can sometimes let you run away in the worst of situations, which, while unlikely, is still nice to have. Lastly, for the universal dwarf racials, we have Stone Form, which is actually a pretty decent defensive cooldown since it increases your armor by 10% and gets rid of bleeds, poisons, and diseases. The armor is universally useful for all melee enemies, so that is nice to have, but the cleansing effect of it can be even better if you are going to die to a dot or you are in certain places like the Plaguelands where almost every mob has super annoying diseases. For priest racials, dwarves get the best in the game by far, with access to Desperate Prayer and Fear Ward. Desperate Prayer is the same for dwarves as it is for humans and can easily save you in a pinch. Fear Ward is arguably the strongest priest racial in the game, especially for endgame content, in which fear mechanics run rampant. The fear immunity is still quite good while questing though, since a few dungeon mobs and open world mobs have fears that can quickly cause fights to spiral out of control if extra enemies are pulled. Additionally, since it lasts 10 minutes and has a 30-second cooldown, you can almost always keep it up at all times, which makes it very reliable to have. Thank you for watching this video so far, and I want to thank all my viewers for their support recently. If you enjoyed the video so far, it would help me out a lot if you decide to like and subscribe for more videos like this one. Seeing as an overwhelming majority of my viewers are not subscribed, it would really help me out if y'all hit that sub button below. Now, back to the video. Now, past the halfway point at 4th, we have Trolls, who I think have the most underrated racials in the game. First, Trolls have access to Beast Slang, which gives them an extra 5% damage to Beast, and seeing as Beasts are one of, if not the most common enemy type you encounter while questing, it has surprisingly high uptime and relevancy. While it isn't very flashy, the extra 5% damage could easily save you from death if you pull one too many beasts in the wild, or you're fighting something like King Bangalash. Next, Trolls have access to Berserking, which gives a pretty sizable bonus to attack and cast speed, with it being larger the lower health you are. This is a pretty sizable damage cooldown, which can easily save you from death while on your way to 60. While upwards of 30% of attack speed can seem minimal, in practice it definitely can save you from near death. Next, Trolls have Throwing and Bow specialization, and while Throwing is pretty useless, Bow spec isn't awful considering bows are generally stronger than guns while leveling due to the option available. Bow skill is a bit worse than some other weapon skills though, due to the way hit chance works with ranged weapons, but it isn't a big deal since weapon skills are pretty low impact while questing anyway. In my opinion, the best troll racial is Regeneration, which, while it seems minimal, I would argue can save you more times than most would think. In addition to providing 10% extra regeneration out of combat, which reduces your downtime, it also keeps 10% of your health regen while in combat, which, while it is small, can add up to a lot, especially with how long combat can take in Classic, primarily in sticky situations involving 3 or more enemies. Regeneration, in my opinion, is very underrated and should be appreciated a lot more. Lastly, for priest racials for Troll, they have Hex of Weakness and Shadow Guard. Hex of Weakness can be decent since it reduces the damage done and healing by a target, which can come in clutch, especially for enemies with healing spells or with fast attack speeds like cats. Shadow Guard is basically just Lightning Shield, but with shadow damage, so it is pretty nice to have as it adds decent DPS boosts to priests, especially with Shadow Form. Now, rounding out the top 3, we have Gnomes, which have just 4 racials, but one of which I would consider extremely strong. Arcane Resistance is likely the worst of the gnome racials, since resistance racials generally are unnoticeable, but also because Arcane is a relatively uncommon damage type, especially compared to Frost or Shadow. Expansive Bind gives a 5% intellect bonus to gnomes, which is decent for the extra mana it provides for spellcasting classes, which can situationally save you from death with 1 extra blink or shadow bolt. Engineering specialization is actually quite good with the plus 15 skill it gives. This is because engineering is widely considered the best profession for hardcore, so having access to many engineering bombs and target dummies with more ease can be a lifesaver, or at least just save you some time. The last gnome racial in my opinion is probably one of the best in the game, and that is Escape Artist, which removes all root and slow effects from the player character other than Dazed. While Escape Artist is exceptionally strong in PvP, it is still quite good for PvE, as many of the most dangerous mobs in the game have root effects such as Frost Novas or Nets, and since this racial has a 1-minute cooldown, it is almost always up. Roots can spell certain death in many scenarios, so having Escape Artist on a class with no escapes like Warrior or Warlocks is extremely strong and makes Gnome much safer on hardcore for those classes in particular. Just barely out of the top spot, I've chosen to put Undead. All of the non-priest undead racials I would say are good, and none of them are particularly useless like many other races in the game. The weakest of them, Shadow Resistance, still has some use since many of the deadliest mobs in the game have very hard-hitting shadow bolts, so one extra resist can save your life, even if it is rare. Then Undeads have Will of the Forsaken, which instantly removes any charm, fear, or sleep used on you, in addition to making you immune for the next 5 seconds. While these status effects are a bit rarer than roots while questing out in the world, they still can be a huge threat if they do happen. And since Will of the Forsaken can be used in more situations, it'd be argued that it is better than Escape Artist. Additionally, many difficult dungeons have enemies with charms, fears, or sleeps, so having access to Will of the Forsaken can save you or your dungeon run if things get out of hand. Next, Undead have access to Cannibalize, allowing Undead to eat corpses to regain health at about the rate of on-level bandages. Since it only has a 2-minute cooldown, it has decent uptime, and can significantly speed up questing speed and reduce downtimes between pulls. Another thing to consider is that it can be used in combat, which can actually prove to be useful for classes with stuns or roots, since they can use that time to devour nearby corpses for health in a pinch if they don't have bandages on them or if they're out of mana. The last racial ability for all undead is Underwater Breathing, which increases their breath timer to 4 minutes from the standard 1 minute. This can be deceptively really helpful, as drowning is a very common way to die in hardcore. Having the extra 3 minutes can make the threat of drowning relatively trivial in most scenarios, so for hardcore, I would consider this an extremely strong racial. As far as priest racials go, Touch of Weakness is alright and has its uses at some points. Devouring Plague on the other hand can be pretty good for the residual damage and healing it provides, and while not the strongest of priest racials, it is still dependable and nice to have. Now, lastly, onto the best race for WoW Classic Hardcore leveling in my opinion, we have Tauren. Taurens only have 4 racials, with 2 being pretty negligible for hardcore, but the other 2 are so good I think they deserve the top spot. First, Taurens have a passive plus 15 to their herbalism, which is nice, but doesn't really help with survival in hardcore, and is useless if you don't take herbalism as a gathering profession. Next, Tauren have nature resistance, which is pretty irrelevant since nature spells are not super common, and the resistance is too low to be reliably useful. Onto the actually good racials though, Taurens do have endurance, which gives them an extra 5% base max health. This talent is very strong in my opinion, as their extra health can be life-saving in many situations, and it can't be understated how often players live with just a sliver of HP left. Having the extra life is also far more reliable than most other racials in the game, as it is useful in every survival situation, as HP is your most valuable resource. Now, the last racial Taurens have access to is also extremely strong, and that is War Stomp. This ability allows the player to do an AoE stun on up to 5 enemies in an 8-yard radius for 2 seconds, with the ability having a 2-minute cooldown. I have seen this stun allow for the getaways of so many players so many times, and having an AoE stun, no matter the class, on only a 2-minute cooldown is extremely strong. War Stomp allows for many classes to get away and make gaps that they usually can't, but it can additionally serve as an AoE interrupt for classes without reliable ways to do that. And that concludes my ranking of every race in World of Warcraft from worst to best for WoW Classic Hardcore. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe for more videos like this one. If there are any rankings you would change, let me know in the comments below. With that being said, I'm out.